We have two speakers, and both are well-positioned to help us understand some of the developments that are taking place in Europe at this time. David Kirkham, who you'll see noted on the program as a senior fellow for comparative law and international policy at the center, is in addition to that currently the academic director of the BYU London Center. And so that's where he is headquartered and situated these days. We'll hear first from David, and then after that, Michael Jensen, who is the area legal counsel in the Office of General Counsel of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, will speak. David.
Thank you, Brett. I'm here to speak about Britain, but Mike and I are both aware that the only thing that stands between you and the weekend are Mike, me, and Cole. Unlike, I say this in way not of apology, but in way of preparation for my approach, unlike the acclaimed practitioners you've just heard from and that you'll hear from with Mike or many of the law professors you've heard before, I consider myself a historian with a law degree who teaches in a political science department and who happens to know a lot about 1960s rock and roll. In fact, a few weeks ago, I gave a presentation on religious freedom in Preston, England, to the UK and Ireland chapter of the J. Reuben Clark Law Society. And afterwards, I was sitting at lunch with the attendees, and I was telling them how the local pop group, the Hollies, was the first of the UK rock bands to introduce three-part harmonies by adding Tony Hicks' harmony below the lead vocalist Alan Clark to Graham Nash's harmony above the lead. And one of the attendees looked me straight in the eye and he said, "You should have given your presentation on that." Well, I like irony. I don't know what that means about the presentation, actually, but I enjoy irony. It has a way of stretching my mind and causing me to think of things in a different light. 31 years ago this week, I was living in Britain, working as a U.S. Air Force judge advocate, practicing law in the mother country, so to say, and rather relishing the possibility that the baby we were expecting would be born on the 4th of July in the nation from which we Americans had won our independence. The irony was heightened by the fact that I was part of a standing army. Standing armies being one of the chief complaints that our colonist forebears had towards the crown. As it was, to my initial disappointment, our baby was born on the 2nd of July, and it was only later that I learned that the day the resolution for independence was voted was actually the 2nd of July in the Continental Congress, and the day of which John Adams said, "The 2nd day of July, 1776, will be the most memorable epoch in the history of America. I am apt to believe that it will be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival. It ought to be commemorated as the day of deliverance by solemn acts of devotion to God Almighty. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other, from this time forward forevermore." So there's some irony there, some coincidence there, and I might add, we named our daughter Brittany. But what are the questions for today? As a result of Brexit, will there be another historical irony that will come about and find Britain celebrating some kind of independence from Europe Day sometime in the future? Why or why not? And why should Americans who are interested in religious freedom care one way or another? Not only from a legal standpoint, but from historical, cultural, political standpoints as well. A quick reminder for those of you who may not have been paying attention, Brexit was Britain's recent vote on whether to leave the European Union, with those voting to leave winning the contest by a 52 to 48% margin. Now, right up front, I will say I don't really think there will be a future Brexit Independence Day for a variety of reasons. Britain lacked the ties with Europe that we felt so closely to Britain in our day. The country was too closely divided on the decision and hadn't really been a member of the EU for that long. And there wasn't much blood spilt over the question, although there was a member of Parliament, a woman who was a Remain MP, who was killed, and her assailant at his court appearance cried, "My name is death to traitors, freedom for Britain." So there were some strong emotions on this side, or on this decision. Still, whether commemorated or vilified in the future, it must be said that Brexit is important. And so I want to spend the next few minutes making some tentative observations about the implications, how these implications may affect Americans who are interested in religious liberty. I'll look at the following points of analysis. I want to say something about the British heritage to America and our special relationship, about the similar political atmospheres in both nations right now, about the divisiveness that is common in both countries, related to some extent to immigration and security issues. And then I'll conclude with a statement about how both countries seem to have a special understanding of human rights and their role in protecting human rights. I returned from London, where I've spent the last year, just a few days before the actual Brexit vote. And I'm quite jealous that I'm not actually there for the debate that's been going on, the discussions that have been going on since. But I've relied on some British friends and colleagues in the last couple of days, sending them notes and trying to stay up on it, and especially some who are involved in religious freedom. So one, John Kinahan, who's a human rights and religious freedom monitor and activist, recently wrote to me, quote, "Regarding Brexit and freedom of religion or belief, probably the most honest answers that can be given are the ones that you've already given. No one really knows what the impact may be, beyond that it is unlikely to be good. We do know that the times they are a-changing. As I received this morning from the office of Baroness Berridge, who's the chair of the UK All-Party Parliamentary Group on International Religious Freedom, a note which states, quote, "Yesterday's APPG meeting provided a somber insight into the new political landscape we now face post-Brexit. As we heard, the nature of the government machinery has significantly altered to focus on EU-related issues and the renegotiation of trade deals. Inevitably, this shift will make raising human rights and freedom of religion more difficult with the government. Therefore, it will require more creative methods to ensure human rights are not sidelined further. Ensuring freedom of religion or belief is on the trade agenda is perhaps now more essential than ever before." And so then they were talking about bringing Lord Green to speak on this issue, who has spent quite some time on the Trade and Investment Committee of the House of Lords. So one reason that we in the U.S. ought to pay attention is because of our strong British heritage and our special relationship. We as Latter-day Saints have a strong British heritage. We all know that those early Mormon pioneers were made up of many people from the British Isles. In the American Heritage class, which we teach here on constitutional development at BYU, we include a lecture on the English legacy to American constitutional thought. America's strong Christian heritage was largely transplanted from Britain. So we have this heritage. I remember my neighbor one time when we lived there in the 1980s, we had bought some antiques, and he looked at us and he said, "Oh, you're stealing our heritage." And I said, "It's every bit as much my heritage as it is yours." Britain's Christian beginnings have achieved at times mythical proportions. There's a legend that Joseph of Arimathea brought Jesus to what is now ancient England, or what was ancient England, and is memorialized in the song Jerusalem, which many British citizens would like to see replace God Save the Queen as the national anthem. The lyrics by the mystical poet William Blake state in part, "And did those feet in ancient time walk upon England's mountains green? And was the Holy Lamb of God on England's pleasant pastures seen?" When you have that kind of a myth, it gives power to your religion and your religious heritage that might not otherwise be there. We also share with Britain traditions of an ancient constitutional and legal order. In fact, Magna Carta, whose 800th anniversary we commemorated last year, is more celebrated in the United States than in the UK. I have had British lawyers and scholars thank Americans for keeping alive Magna Carta's notion of limitations on state power. As Britain's church-state relationships evolved, we're all probably familiar with Henry VIII's founding of the Church of England as it broke away from the Roman Catholic Church over the issue of Henry's desire to have a divorce and marry Anne Boleyn. The bloody fluctuation between Protestant and Catholic power that this initiated has been memorialized by a famous statue in Oxford, noting in particular that under the reign of the deaths of many martyrs under the reign of Queen Mary, including Hugh Latimer, Nicholas Ridley, and Thomas Cranmer. The story goes that they were about to be burned at the stake, and Latimer turned to Ridley and declared, "Play the man, Master Ridley. We shall this day light such a candle, by God's grace, in England, as I trust shall never be put out." In many ways, that has proved prophetic, and those fires of religious liberty still burn brightly. I could say more on British heritage to American freedoms. The French philosopher Montesquieu mistakenly analyzed the unwritten British Constitution to suggest a separation of powers that, while not quite real in Britain, became very real in the Constitution of the United States. "There is as yet," says Montesquieu, "there is as yet no liberty if the power of judging be not separated from legislative power and the executive power." And speaking of power in general, he said, "It is necessary from the very nature of things that power should be a check to power." So this feeds into the notion of his Swiss contemporary, Voltaire, who recognized this with regard to religious freedom when he said in 1733, "If there were only one religion in England, there would be danger of despotism. If there were two, they would cut each other's throats. But there are 30, and they live in peace and happiness." Now, let me say a word about the similar political atmospheres currently in the UK and the US. Every so often, this is what I take from the historian side of me, every so often there comes about in the history of the world movements in different locations that are so similar in tone, if not result, that one senses that they are part of a bigger picture. Whether these occur as a result of coincidence, conspiracy, or cosmology remains largely unknown, and perhaps they are part of all of these. But the phenomena are real. For example, the age of the democratic revolutions in the 18th century, or the rise of socialism in the 19th century, or fascism in the 20th century. We would be naive to think that such phenomena would not occur again in history, especially in a day of instant communication and rapid transportation. But it may be difficult to perceive what's actually happening if we find ourselves inside the eye of the storm to give us the perspective we would need to understand it. I don't necessarily claim to have a better perspective than anyone else on this, but I do allow for the possibility that we're in the middle of something big. I used to think that I'd been cheated out of living in all the interesting times in history, but now I'm more prone to proclaim, like one of my students that I used to have from the Republic of Georgia, he said one day in class, "In China they say, 'May you live in interesting times.' In Georgia we say, 'May the Chinese live in interesting times.'" But we have our strong divisions, both here and in the UK. In the UK, the strong divisions exist between Labour and Conservatives, Scottish and English, and now even the old and young, as the older members of British society have just handed the younger members a political and governmental fait accompli that the rising generation did not want. I saw one tweet following the vote that said, from a young person saying, "Now can we have a referendum on whether the young can live independently of the older people?" If the political atmospheres are similar, perhaps the two countries can look at developments within each other's borders as potential harbingers, like Paris setting fashion trends that Americans may follow. And if we don't like what we see, we might ask, as did Scrooge to the ghost of Christmas yet to come in Christmas Carol, as the ghost was showing Scrooge his grave. "Before I draw nearer to that stone to which you point," said Scrooge, "answer me one question. Are these the shadows of the things that will be, or are they shadows of things that may be only?" Among the most prominent trends in Europe in general and in the UK in particular is a general indifference towards religion, punctuated by fear of extremism. So many who are interested in religion find themselves more caught up in the protection of other human rights, or even would-be human rights. And this is aggravated when a terrorist act is done in the name of religion. So the non-religious tend to declare, and these are the people whose rights you want me to protect. In other words, they're losing the motivation, the understanding of why this may be important. And although Brexit fueled divisiveness in largely and ostensibly economic ways, there was a New York Times article you may have seen this past week about Wigan, which is a northern England town that was made famous by George Orwell, the road to Wigan Pier, when he was exposing the abuses of the coal mining industry back in the early 20th century. And Wigan, on the vote to leave, for the first time since 1910, voted against the Labour Party. The Labour Party, which espoused staying in the EU, Wigan voted against. And some of them said, well, it's because we have all these foreigners coming in and taking jobs. But the reality is there were only 2% of the residents of Wigan who were foreigners, whereas 11% country all nationwide. And so when others were interviewed on this, they mostly were saying, we don't want to be told by Brussels or even London what to do. If we go back to my friend John Kinahan again on questions of immigration and security, he says, as you've already indicated, the impact on freedom of religion of Muslims, and indeed anyone perceived to be different, is not at present looking to be good. Most UK politicians show few signs of considering how to tackle this, even though we have had the very new trend in the UK of one pro-EU MP being murdered, the one I mentioned, and two having had death threats. Similarly, the impact on Northern Ireland will not be good. However, these problems do not yet seem to be primarily about freedom of religion or belief, but about other freedoms. We will have to wait and see where the evidence leads. Well, whether part of a larger phenomenon or not, it can't be denied that the atmosphere, especially over the last year in Britain, has been divisive and resounded with similar overtones as we're experiencing in the U.S. It may not have seemed as crazy from our perspective on this side of the Atlantic, but I can assure you that my colleagues in Britain who have been quick to deride the Clinton-Trump divide here have been just as quick to condemn as crazy the divisions that occurred over the Leave and Remain Brexit debate. David Brooks, New York Times op-ed writer, this week wrote about divisiveness in British politics, compared it with the US. He said, these days, if you want to elect a leader, you generally have two choices: a sensible establishment figure who is completely out of touch, or a populist outsider who is incompetent, crazy, or both. This was the choice British Labour Party members faced in 2015 when they were picking a new leader. They went with the incompetent, inexperienced outsider, Jeremy Corbyn. He recently lost a no-confidence vote among members of Parliament in his own party, 172 to 40. This was the choice, according to Brooks, Republican voters in the states faced throughout the primaries. Passing up the out-of-touch insiders, they went for, in his words, an overflowing souffle of crazy incompetence instead. And this is certainly the choice that confronts members of the British Conservative Party. Calm cluelessness comes to them in the form of David Cameron. He was a good prime minister, but he called for a Brexit referendum for short-term political gain, blithely unaware of what was happening in his own nation. Says Brooks, the big historical context is this: something fundamental is shifting in our politics. The insiders can't see it. Outsiders get thrown up amid the tumult, but they are too marginal, eccentric, and inexperienced to lead effectively. Finally, I want to say a word about the British understanding of human rights. A couple of years ago, I happened to visit the House of Lords when they were debating whether to pull out of the European Court of Human Rights. ICLRS monitors closely the European Court of Human Rights, and there have been some interesting cases, even regarding Latter-day Saints, that have come before the European Court in recent years, including Preston Temple case, a tax exemption case which the church lost. The European Court is not part of the EU, but it's part of the Council of Europe. Its mandate is taken from the European Convention on Human Rights, and the current front-runner of the Conservatives, front-runner for Prime Minister of the Conservatives, Theresa May, at one time had called for Britain's abandonment of that court and then withdrawal as well of the from the Council of Europe. But I ask, is this an indication that the UK has no interest or less interest than Europe in human rights? And I would say not necessarily. For good or ill, it may be an indication that they think in Britain that they can do human rights better. They think that they have this long tradition that goes back at least to the English Civil Wars of the 1600s and so forth, and that they shouldn't be lectured to by Europeans about what it means to guarantee human rights. Again, my friend John Kinahan, Brexit sets a context where the human rights included in the European Convention are called into question. The suggestions of some that a British Bill of Rights or something similar can be a replacement is profoundly undermining of the universality of human rights, something that oppressive regimes around the world will welcome. That's John's opinion. But Britain seems to be acting from a position of thinking that Europe has little to teach them with regard to human rights. In this, Americans and even Utahns are similar. It wasn't but a couple of years ago that our state legislators were debating whether to allow for Martin Luther King commemorative license plates, the proceeds from which would go for human rights training. When I asked my state legislator why he opposed the bill, he said, in effect, "I don't stand for international human rights, but for the God-given rights enshrined in our Constitution and the Declaration of Independence." While I acknowledge a profound gratitude for this American iteration of rights, I did point out to him that many people think that many of the rights enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights are also God-given, including some of the framers of that document. And I mentioned to him that it's not the American Constitution that allows our young LDS missionaries to enter other countries to teach the gospel. It's not the American Constitution that protects the rights of our own congregations in other countries. It's not the U.S. Constitution that allows my daughter now to work as a missionary in Japan, or my son who's 100 yards from here over in the MTC, who I wish I could see, to head off to Korea here in a couple of weeks. Still, we do have a notion that as Americans, we have a firmer grip on what freedom means than many other nations do. It's part of what I call the good guy syndrome, the sense we have of ourselves that we are generally good guys on the world stage. I once was teaching a group of international students at BYU an American heritage course, and I asked them, first of all, is this an accurate perception of America, and is it a good perception or not? And they agreed that it is accurate. We do think we're the good guys. And they said, whether that's good or not depends. If you thinking of yourselves as the good guys makes you try harder to be good guys, that's a good thing. But on the other hand, if it makes you think that whatever you do is good, it's a bad thing. Still, fear and indifference are hurting religious freedom in the UK today. It can ironically be tied to the existence of a state church there. I'm not going to take the time to talk about that. That is another lecture, but there is some irony there that there is a state-established church, and yet freedom of religion suffers to some extent. Let me just conclude with a couple of more thoughts from my friend John. He says, one of the most disturbing features of the campaign was the large-scale repeated peddling of lies, especially by the Leave campaign. It has not taken them long after the vote to disavow them. The other side of that coin is that voters not troubling whether claims may be true or not. Both Ruth, his wife, and I have had the experience of meeting people quite uninterested in whether or not claims being made are true. The indication of a collapse in integrity in public life is a disturbing precedent for addressing any issue in public life, including freedom of religion or belief. We are sadly a long way from the standards of integrity in public life that Christians of all political views should defend, and even the Archbishop of Canterbury has been silent on this. I think in the interest of time, I'll skip some of his other comments, but I did want to share this last one with you from him. He says, on your question, another question I'd asked him. He says, from my now dead parents' experience, one of the more important answers as to why Americans should care about freedom of religion and human rights in Europe is that American servicemen and women have died in large numbers to help save us when we Europeans have made catastrophic mistakes. This brings for me an unrepayable debt of gratitude to the American people. When there is much division among democracies encouraged by some, it is probably good at this time to remember the reasons why we should be grateful for our friends and neighbors. And he spells neighbors with a U. So, are we on the same path? Do we learn something from Europe, and particularly at this time from Brexit and Britain? Time will tell. But if we're concerned, we may do well to ponder once more, ponder the path, and revisit once more the words of Charles Dickens with regard to Scrooge. Still the ghost pointed downward to the grave by which it stood. Said Scrooge, men's courses will foreshadow certain ends to which, if persevered in, they must lead. But if the courses be departed from, the ends will change. Say it is thus with what you show me. Thank you very much.
Well, it's an honor to be with you. I've enjoyed the conference so far, and thank David Kirkham for that interesting, even stirring and thoughtful beginning to this session. I'm going to take a little bit of a different tack that perhaps is going to end up in a couple of examples of issues in religious freedom that as a church, the LDS Church, is observing in Europe. But first, just a couple of comments which are perhaps commonly understood by those who are here. Europe, of course, is going through and has been going through, for especially the last couple of years, some enormous transitions, waves of refugees in the seven figures have flooded into Europe. Europe, in some ways, will never be the same. And this flood of refugees, some of whom are fleeing literally for their lives, others who are coming to Europe more for economic reasons. This flood of refugees was one of several reasons cited by the Leave campaign in Britain for voting in favor of Brexit. There are positive possibilities in some ways in Europe that we can see and perhaps even learn from in the United States. A couple of years ago, the European Union adopted guidelines on religious freedom, which most of us in this room would endorse and agree with, and just recently appointed its representative to other countries on behalf of the EU to talk about and in an EU setting try to enforce those guidelines for religious freedom. That's a positive thing. In the UK, David has already referred to the all-party parliamentary group, which is intended as a group across parliaments, especially in Europe, but also throughout the Commonwealth, to combine those who are parliamentarians who have an interest in religious liberty. And despite Baroness Berridge's comment on the increased difficulty of focusing attention on religious liberty issues because of Brexit and other challenges right now, the very fact that this is developing is a positive sign. And there are efforts underway within the British Commonwealth and the countries that formerly were part of the British Empire to focus interest on religious freedom. So all of those are positive things, or could be positive things, that are happening in Europe right now. Now let me refer just briefly to a couple of potential pieces of legislation which raise religious freedom issues and perhaps from which we can learn here in the United States and perhaps be on the lookout in our legislations as to the risks that they pose. The first is in the UK. This is an out-of-school education and counterterrorism legislation initiative. Now, let me repeat that because those might not ordinarily seem to belong together. Out-of-school education and counterterrorism legislation. Now, there is no drafted legislation yet. This idea was put forth in concept just before Christmas last year. It was put out for public comment. But let me just quickly, in 3 or 4 bullet points, state what it is intended to encapsulate when the legislation will be proposed. And then I'll ask you what issues you might see with those bullet points. So first, this proposal would require registration and inspection of organizations, including churches, which provide, quote, intensive, close quote, out-of-school education of youth. It defines intensive education as 6 to 8 hours or more per week, and youth as those aged 12 to 18 years. It requires education to be consistent with shared or British values, and it's intended to address radicalization of youth by religious groups. Now, without the passing of microphones, I'll try to repeat brief comments that you might provide. What are your thoughts on that proposed piece of legislation? Back here, speak loudly, please.
My question is, what is the definition of radical? I mean, who's going to define that?
Okay, well, I'm not here to define it for you, but right, the comment or the question is, what is radical? So that's an issue, yes.
One concern would be, what is the definition of British values if Britain has adopted, say, same-sex marriage, and LDS seminary students aged 12 to 18 are being taught something different from that?
Okay, so the comment, what is the definition of British values? If that includes, because Britain does have a same-sex marriage statute, and how would that jibe or not jibe with what LDS students are taught in seminary? Okay?
Also, who gets to decide what the definition of British values is, and on whose whim does that definition get to change?
Okay, so who's going to decide what British values are? Well, you've identified instantly, without being previously apprised of this proposed legislation, some of the questions, legitimate questions, that are raised by this proposed legislation. So, despite vigorous opposition or question-making, including by religious groups in the UK, but not just by religious groups, the government has seemed to push forward with its desire to propose the legislation. Now, admittedly, in light of Brexit, it remains to be seen how quickly this will be pushed forward. Probably there's going to be a delay because the British government is going to be pretty busy for a while. Nevertheless, there doesn't seem to be an indication of pullback, at least not preliminarily, in light of Brexit. So what are the implications? Well, this proposed legislation would absolutely impact the LDS Church. When you think of the number of hours of seminary and young men and young women and Sunday school and sacrament meeting, priesthood meeting for the young men and young women, we exceed the 6 to 8 hours threshold. The education, the religious education that happened in those settings would be subject to British government inspection and evaluation. And it will be, since it will be illegal to teach content contrary to British values, obviously, as has been pointed out by you already, that could include teachings on family and marriage and other gospel topics with which we may disagree. Now, it's interesting that teachers who are found to teach contrary to British values may be issued a, quote, extremist disruption order, quote, unquote. Only a lawyer could have come up with that phrase, I think, which labels that teacher on public records as an extremist. And if a teacher then breaches, once again after having been issued an extremist disruption order, this requirement to teach only British values, it would result in a criminal conviction up to 5 years of imprisonment. So here we have in, at the cradle of a country from which we have sprung, sharing human rights traditions, cloaked in the idea of countering radicalization and prompted in part by this wave of immigration coming into Europe, this astonishing proposal for legislation. And what is the church doing? We have joined in a coalition, a broad coalition with other religious confessions of similar views to express our concerns with the legislation. And we'll see how that goes. Now, the next one I want to refer to briefly is of a different character. You can see that this out of schools proposal falls closer to the core values and the core issues which Elder Wickman talked about yesterday morning. The second one may be more on the periphery, but because of the way it's come forward and its content is also of some concern. This is called the Equal Treatment Directive, and the context is in the European Union. So on its face, the Equal Treatment Directive proposes something that can be good. It prohibits discrimination or harassment on the grounds of disability, age, religion, and sexual identity in the supply of goods and services. So the Equal Treatment Directive has been percolating in the EU instruments and organizations over a number of years. Right now, it's before the European Council, which is the final stage of the EU legislative process. And the current draft has been stalled there for about 6 years. Now, any directive at the EU must pass the European Council unanimously. The only country that has expressed outward opposition to the Equal Treatment Directive is Germany, and that is somewhat fragile. Now, the pressure from the LGBT community to pass the directive is increasing, and there are a number of countries that are strongly in favor of it. If passed by the European Council, then those who are members of the EU, the countries who are members, will be directed to pass their own legislation, country by country, that essentially matches and gives effect to this directive. Okay, well, what are some possible issues with this? Again, the objective of the directive may in many ways be good. There are, however, some issues to pay attention to. So a violation occurs if a complainant feels subjectively offended or harassed. So it's a subjective test. There's no defense for a defendant acting from conscience or under religious belief. And interestingly, there are presumptions to facilitate the proving of discrimination or harassment. Now, I'm sorry to sound a little legalistic here, but generally when someone brings a complaint, that person needs to bring forth evidence that shows the complaint to be valid. Here, in essence, the burden of proof is flipped. And so a defendant who's been accused of violating this directive must come forward and establish that he or she, or it, if it's an institution, is not guilty of violating. So that's problematic. And there are state-funded authorities which will seek out cases and assist complainants. Obviously, there's no similar assistant for defendants. And a complainant need not be the person who is offended or harassed. So it's kind of an attorney general concept. Someone who's not been offended or harassed can come forward and bring a complaint on behalf of someone else. Okay, let me pause there for just a moment. And like we did with the last one, any issues with that you see? Just quickly. Bullet points only. Yes?
It's hard to prove a negative.
Okay, hard to prove a negative on this flipping of the burden of proof. Okay? Any other comments, please?
Doesn't seem like there's a religious institution exemption.
There is not a religious institution, and there is no freedom of religion or belief exemption. So if someone is acting out of what they believe is a legitimate religious belief, that's no protection under the Act. Okay?
I'd posit a couple of for instances. Someone is subjected to church discipline for engaging in homosexual conduct, or who loses a temple recommend or deny church employment for that kind of conduct, could make a case.
Okay, now yes, Bob, that could happen if the directive were drafted a bit differently. Let's remember that this is like the florist and the baker kinds of cases. This prohibits discrimination or harassment on the basis of disability or religion or sexual identity in the provision of goods and services. So thankfully, some kind of internal church autonomy action like that would not be covered by the directive. Okay, just one or two quick ones. Yes?
Well, the question is, does the temple provide a service to a person when they go through and receive their endowments and so forth? Would that be defined as a service?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Does the temple provide a service to someone that might be captured? I think that the definitions of the providing of goods and services would not reach that far. So probably that's not a problem that we would have to be concerned about. One last one.
But solemnizing a wedding ceremony probably would be considered a service.
Yeah, sure. If you owned a facility at which, at which weddings were held, that would be a good or a service offered to the public. Now, Brett was just saying in the background, what about temples? In Europe, there are a few countries where sealings in an LDS temple are recognized as civil marriages. And we don't have time to kind of go through one by one and parse those. But generally speaking, in Europe, we don't have a problem with the temples because in most countries, it's required that you be married by civil authority before you go to a temple and then be sealed by ecclesiastical authority. All right, well, we don't know, pardon me, what's going to happen with the Equal Treatment Directive. And the church is considering what, if any, kind of activity it might undertake with a coalition of groups similarly minded that will express opposition to the ETD or suggest amendments that would make it more acceptable. I think just in conclusion, my point here is that it isn't just in the U.S. we have issues of concern. There are issues of concern for religious freedom across the world, but there are similar sources of solutions, and it involves people like you and institutions in which you participate. And one of those, of course, is the LDS Church, which tries to monitor and then selectively, with priesthood approval, engage in concert with others of like minds to preserve our choices and opportunities to exercise freedom of religion and belief. Thank you.
All right, we have about 8 minutes for Q&A, so let me open the floor. There's a question up here. Let's each try to be brief, and I'll have our panelists respond question by question, and hopefully we can just rattle through a few questions quickly.
Thank you very much. My question is about hate speech laws. I don't think either of you talked about those a whole lot, but those have become increasingly more common in Europe. For example, I believe a Pentecostal preacher was prosecuted and jailed for preaching against homosexuality in his congregation. And also I know a cardinal in Spain is being prosecuted currently for doing the same. So I'm just wondering if either of you would be willing to comment on maybe what the church is doing or any issues you see with those, or sort of what the church's strategy is with dealing with those in Europe.
So I think I'm going to need you to deliver the hand mic here since we don't have, well, maybe I can.
Either that, or you can answer the question.
I am a mere moderator.
Modest moderator.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the specifics of the examples that you've mentioned. Yes, the church does try to monitor situations like that in appropriate cases where, again, the appropriate level of church priesthood leaders determine that there's an issue for us that we share with others of like beliefs, then we can engage in collective action to help others, and we've done that. So I'm sorry that I can't comment specifically on those two cases you've mentioned, but that's kind of how we operate in principle. We do monitor, and on a very selective basis, where it appears that we can make a difference in coalition with others, we will engage.
Can we go up here for?
I was just going to add real quickly, and although I'm not prepared to talk about the specific cases either, but for the benefit of the audience, of course, the concern about hate speech laws is the concern we had about the other laws that Mike was talking about, and that's definitions, and when you start defining what's hate. And so if a Mormon missionary knocks on somebody's door and says, my religion is true, is that by implication your religion is false, therefore I'm insulting you, and that it's by somehow falls under these laws. So those are the kinds of things we want to avoid.
My question is about the out-of-school legislation that you were talking about. I see a genuine concern by the people in Europe and people in this country about this large influx of people who aren't assimilated into the culture of the country. And I suspect that that's what that is aimed at. Is there an effort by those who are concerned about the legitimate concerns that you've raised to come up with a different kind of assimilation education that maybe is sponsored by the schools or by the government that would alleviate that concern so that they don't go to this extreme?
Yeah, if I understand the question correctly, it's a great one. Whether we're talking about the U.S. or to a lesser extent about the U.K., we're dealing with situations of migrations over time, changes in the nature of the population. Certainly, that's true in the U.S. because we were born that way. And you point to a very important need, and that is integration. So assimilation of those who have come in. Now, Germany, for example, is trying to put a lot of resources into assimilating the 1+ million refugees who come into the country. And on an individual basis, under guidelines that have been proposed by church leaders that we've heard about in conference and so forth, church members are engaged in those assimilation efforts, and they're supported and encouraged, at least in some cases, by the government. So that might mean teaching of German, or helping with job coaching skills, or looking for employment types of skills. And that's the key, really. And we can help here in the U.S., and I hope church members are helping in Europe, not taking a reactive, this is my country approach, but instead be more inclusive in helping others who are fleeing for their lives, for example, now to feel it is also their country, which which will reduce radicalization. And one last thing, the church is also engaged in supporting efforts by Brian Grimm and his foundation on education efforts that are designed to address radicalization or anti-radicalization, and some modified church materials are being used in that process.
David, do you have anything to add on the assimilation and integration issue?
I don't think so.
Dwayne?
Well, Mike, you had indicated on this equal treatment. You had indicated on this equal treatment issue that this has been coasting along for 6 years. It would seem to me like there's not a lot of support, and it doesn't have a lot of energy to see the full implementation of that anytime soon. Would you comment on that?
Well, I'm going to disagree with your underlying premises, Dwayne. The only reason it's been percolating for a number of years is because it requires unanimity in the Europe Council. So all it would take at this point is for Germany to change or moderate its opposition, and now it's passed. So there are countries, including the immediate past chair of the European Council, that was energetically behind the ETD. So it's been stalled, but it's been stalled because of the opposition of one country, and that could change.
All right, final question.
Thank you for indulging this particular question, which is directed actually at Professor Kirkham. I was interested in all that you had to say about the British Constitution, but in this regard, they do have a constitutional problem, inasmuch as the referendum is not legally binding because Parliament is sovereign. And with the new Prime Minister to come into office probably in September, she can exercise the reserve powers of the Crown, which in this instance would not be legal because Parliament is sovereign. And since Britain joined the European Union by act of Parliament, it must leave by act of Parliament. So there must be a debate in Parliament before Article 50 of the Treaty of Lisbon can be invoked. Unless they have a 3-line whip, which means that the members must vote the party line, they would be free to vote their consciences. And since the majority of members of both parties, and certainly the Scottish National Party, will vote to remain, don't you feel that there's the possibility that Parliament could vote to remain in the EU? And if that's the case, what happens next?
I think, thank you very much for that question, but I think the possibilities are very, very slim that Parliament is going to go against the referendum. What would happen in that case? Who knows? That goes into the realm of constitutional speculation, would be very exciting, would enhance these interesting times that are occurring over there. But I think the possibility that Parliament is going to vote their consciences and go against what is supposedly the will of the people is not going to happen. Now, now you may be familiar with sources that I'm not. I'm trying to read things on all sides to get a feel for what's happening. And there are those who are saying, we never really thought this would happen. Is there any way of taking it back? There really is this sense of the young people feeling like we've been saddled with this by our parents and it's not the future we want. But the political risks of going against the so-called will of the people are too high for me to think this is really going to happen. But I'd love to read other materials that might give even me some hope. So thank you.
All right, let me ask you to join me in thanking our panelists.